Philip, if I have to admit to you, at the end of the day, after all of my strivings, I really want to know, is there an afterlife? Now, you're a philosopher and, shall I say, a non-traditional theologian. How do you come at this question?
It's one of the hardest questions at all. It's one most driven by our passion, by our existential need. Not only what is the significance of my life and what will happen when I die, but people I love who are gone. And we have an incredibly strong wish to see ourselves as, in the future, perhaps still interconnected with them, or interconnected with the divine, or that all the projects of our lives aren't empty.
I have that wish, I have that desire, but I don't want to fool myself.
Yeah, I have to say the note of caution that because we so much want it to be true, we should be all the more careful about our reflections that go in the way.
I agree.
But let me tell you how I'd approach the question.
I don't trust my own intuition.
Let me explore it, and then let's see what we can do with the discussion. First, let's imagine that we can make sense of the view that there's some sort of higher divine power. I've called it panentheism, a sense of a divine that includes the world within itself, but is also more than that world. And so if you'll give me that as a premise.
I'll give you anything you want. Get me an afterlife, you get anything.
Right, and imagine that there's something that it is to be you or me, which is more than the sum total of the physical parts of what we are, right? And thirdly, imagine that this divine being has a property of being eternal, that it pre-existed the world, somehow was creatively involved in creating the world, and survives even after the end of this physical universe.
So I got to make three assumptions now to come along with you. I got to believe that there is this panentheistic God that the world is part of, and that God's more than that. I have to believe that I'm something more than my neurons clicking away, and I have to believe that that God has some eternity to it.
Right. And the trouble is, even with those three assumptions, there's not necessarily a continued personal existence after death, because it might be that the only way in which you survive is as a memory within the divine. A divine who has experienced every moment of your life and forgets nothing.
Some people think that's what we are today.
It's true. We could just be a simulation. But under this view, your subjective self would end at death. But every fact about yourself would be eternally preserved within the divine and valued by the divine. We call that objective immortality. You exist, as it were, as an object in the eternal divine memory, but yourself, your person, is not present.
What does that mean? People can keep photographs of me after I die. What does that mean?
Oh, but this is more than that. Imagine that you've been intimately known, every thought, every response, every part of your body known during your lifespan.
You know, that kind of makes me mad at this panentheistic God of yours. He's taking advantage of me. He made me live my life and struggle, and now he's got my memories, and I don't have existence? You can keep him.
In the end, I also find that notion, objective immortality, unhelpful. Because what I care about is whatever that subjective thing that is to be me, and the subjective relationship with others. So I guess I would feel that if all we could get was objective immortality, we wouldn't have enough.
Again, I would feel resentful. It would not just be not enough. I would feel absolutely resentful.
So let's see if we can get something stronger.
Okay.
Now, all I can try to do is formulate a way that we could think about, let's call it subjective immortality. I can't prove it. I can't show necessarily that it's the most philosophically powerful view, but it's a conception. Okay, and this is how it would go. If we can exist within the divine now, in panentheism, we exist as subjective centers of activity within the overarching divine presence.
Everything exists within God in that theory. It's not just we. This chair exists, the floor, the ceiling, everything.
But what matters for this argument is the subjective part of ourselves exists within the overarching subjective presence of the divine.
Okay, so it's not just the whole physical world as part of this, but whatever there may or may not be of our subjective selves, that also is a self-existent thing within the divine.
Exactly, and that's not trivial, because in much of the history of Western philosophy and theology, one couldn't think those two together. A subjective substance and a God as substance can't exist at the same time in the same place. They have to be separated. on this view, if it works, it allows us already in the here and now to understand a divine subjective presence, including subjective moments within it.
So the divine subjective presence is the panentheistic God's encompassing of all expressions of this subjective feeling, whether it's humans or whether it's animals or wherever it comes from.
Exactly.
All of that is in God,
Yes.
right?
Now let's see if we could think that into the future after our death.
Right.
And I'll call it the position of eschatological hope. Eschaton means the doctrine of final things, and hope because it can't be a proof. It's only, I would say,
That's fair.
a coherent hope.
Okay.
And this is how it would go. After the death of my body, is it possible that that subjective part of myself, which is more than the body, is retained in existence within the divine, not supported by the atoms and molecules that support thought now, but supported directly by the divine presence?
And your argument is because it's there now.
Yeah.
It's there now in some way, even though it is obviously physically related to our bodies and our brains, obviously.
That's beautifully put. If it's possible for that to happen now, my argument, it would be possible for it to happen in the future after the death of my body.
So I guess the big step is the first. If it can happen now, I mean, I'd be more willing to give you the second step if to give the first. The first step's tough.
Oh, well, we've done pretty well then. I mean, if you'll give me the second step, a lot of philosophers resist that one. Then it turns out, and this is a lovely development of the conversation, that the question of survival of death isn't about the future. It's about whether we can understand ourselves now as being real subjects within a divine presence. If yes, then the second step is not so hard. But if that notion here and now is incoherent, we're stuck. And there is no hope for existence after death.
Yeah, and I think that's where the big problem would be, is that first big step. But does that mean that you feel that this panentheistic approach would actually have a higher success rate, no guarantees, but a higher success rate than traditional theism?
I actually think that that's true. Because what can traditional theism do? It has to create some kind of place to put all these substances, these selves, because they can't be within God. So you get at the end of the Bible, the new Jerusalem, a new heaven and a new earth, with streets made out of gold, I presume golden lampposts and so forth, right? To me, that's no longer plausible. Some people would say, well, maybe our cat and dog will be there as well, running along the gold street next to us. That's not a belief of the afterlife I could hold. But if now we exist in some way within the divine, then I could imagine a space not of streets and lampposts, a space of divine presence where we might exist in the future.
So that would mean that the traditional souls of theism are out of place, if you will, pardon the pun, in this panentheistic vision.
The trouble is a philosophical trouble. If we are substances, we have to exist outside the divine substance.
For sure. I mean,
no two substances can exist in the same place.
Yeah, and that is traditional theism, that what God created, the physical universe, and indeed creating all these souls, are independent of God. God may sustain them, God may create them, God may intervene, whatever he wants to do, but they are definitely independent.
Yeah. But now we have almost a syllogism against the traditional belief in life after death. First, souls have to exist outside of God. Second, if souls are to exist later, there has to be a place outside of God for them to exist. That place might be heaven. But if you hold heaven is not a plausible construct any longer, where is it? What is it located of? What are its spaces and times? Then you have to say, for traditional theism, the notion of life after death doesn't make sense.